Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening to viewers in the Indo-Pacific, and greetings to those joining us from elsewhere around the world. Welcome to today's AC Front Page, the Atlantic Council's premier platform for world leaders tackling today's greatest challenges. I'm today's host, Marcus Garlauskas, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We're pleased and honored today to welcome U.S. Congressman John Moolenaar for a discussion on deterring aggression against Taiwan. Congressman Moolenaar has decades of experience in the private and the public sectors and now represents Michigan's 2nd Congressional District. Among other responsibilities, he serves as chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. As chairman, he leads efforts to mitigate the CCP's economic and national security threats to U.S. interests, to counter the CCP's malign influence, and to raise the American people's awareness about the threats the CCP poses. Now, today's discussion comes as the Select Committee recently issued the report 10 More for Taiwan, which put forward key bipartisan findings and recommendations on deterring Chinese Communist Party aggression against Taiwan. Now, as this report outlines, and as I'm sure Chairman Moolenaar will shortly explain further, a CCP attack on Taiwan would be more than just a terrible tragedy for the people of Taiwan, but it would present an acute threat to U.S. prosperity and to U.S. national security. Hence, key executive branch public documents, including the new U.S. National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, have publicly identified deterring CCP aggression against Taiwan and against the rest of the First Island chain as a top priority for the United States. As Chairman Moolenaar will explain, this is also a clear priority for the legislative branch, as Congress plays a key role in enabling and reinforcing such deterrence. Now, more broadly, in our work here at the Atlantic Council, including our Tiger project on war and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, we show that a CCP attack against Taiwan could have larger, dire ramifications in the region and throughout the world. And so this means that deterring such an attack shouldn't be just a priority for the United States and for Taiwan, but also for our friends and allies in the region and around the world. So with all that said, I am looking forward to hearing from Chairman Moolenaar about this report and about the view from Congress on deterring CCP aggression. First with some opening comments from the chairman, followed by what I hope to be a robust and dynamic discussion. Now, for those of you in the in-person and virtual audience, we'll be taking questions later in the discussion, so please head to askac.org, and we may feast your question if it's focused on today's substantive topic. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for joining us, sir, and I welcome you to come to the podium for your opening remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and good morning, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting me today to discuss a core focus of my work as the chairman of the Select Committee on China, which is deterring aggression against Taiwan. But before we get to how to deter Chinese aggression, we must first understand why Taiwan matters to the United States. Taiwan is a vibrant democratic society, a crucial part of world supply chains, and a close partner of the United States. It's one of our top trading partners, a critical link in advanced manufacturing and semiconductor supply chains, and a significant investor in American industry. That relationship supports United States jobs, strengthens supply chain resilience, and helps anchor U.S. reindustrialization. Taiwan is also a reliable, rules-based partner and a vibrant democracy, reinforcing American credibility and stability in a region that directly affects United States prosperity. More broadly, the Indo-Pacific is vital to the global economy, accounting for more than half of global economic output. American security and prosperity depend on the ability to trade and operate freely across the region. If Taiwan falls, the Chinese Communist Party will control the center of gravity along the First Island chain, giving Beijing leverage over supply chains, market access, and maritime commerce that directly underpin U.S. economic power. China's military would also hold a commanding position along the First Island chain, directly threatening U.S. allies such as Japan and the Philippines, constraining U.S. military operations, and increasing the vulnerability of U.S. territory. That is why deterring aggression in the Taiwan Strait is a core U.S. national security interest. Deterring Chinese military aggression in the Taiwan Strait has been a central focus of this committee since its inception. This was the first focus of our original report on Taiwan, and it continues to be emphasized in our new report, 10 More for Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party has increased its provocations, incursions, and coercive actions against Taiwan and the rest of the world. Most troubling is Xi Jinping's mandate to the People's Liberation Army requiring China's military to be prepared, if called upon, to subjugate Taiwan by force and defeat any American military response, this by 2027. The true intentions of Xi Jinping are hard to know, but when a dictator says he's preparing to do something dangerous, all of us must take him at his word. That reality makes 2026 an important year, one in which we must prepare at home and abroad for all scenarios, using all available tools of our national power. This report highlights why the U.S.-Taiwan relationship matters, and most importantly, the urgency needed to establish peace through strength in the Taiwan Strait. The goal is simple: to ensure Beijing never decides that aggression against Taiwan would be fast, cheap, or successful, and that peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific are preserved. Now, as America prepares to mark its 250th anniversary next year, and Taiwan approaches 30 years since its first direct presidential election, our democracies remind the entire world of one crucial fact. Democracy is not an accident. It's a choice, and one that is renewed by every generation. This shared commitment is exactly why Congress continues to strengthen its ties with Taiwan across every domain, diplomatically, economically, and with peace through strength. The coming years will be decisive in shaping Beijing's calculations. We cannot afford complacency, and our message must remain clear. America's commitment to peace, stability, and Taiwan's self-determination is bipartisan and unwavering. That's why Congress will act decisively alongside our allies to deter CCP aggression, defend democratic values, and ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. With that, I look forward to our discussion, and thanks for having me today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those excellent comments. That was a tremendously effective way to set the stage for this conversation. And there was a word that you mentioned today, and one that I heard you mention very prominently in your hearing yesterday, and that is bipartisan. So Atlantic Council prides itself on being a bipartisan organization. The Scowcroft Center is committed to advancing U.S. bipartisan strategy and policy. And so this is very challenging in the current environment. It's challenging in any environment. And so many people focus on the executive branch, as I alluded in my remarks. But I think it'd be helpful to begin if you could tell our audience a little bit more about how you achieve that bipartisanship and what it's really like to work on the committee and how the committee plays a role in advancing these issues.
Sure. Well, first, I want to commend, at that time, Speaker McCarthy and Leader Jeffries, as well as Speaker Johnson, because they have been absolutely committed to this in a bipartisan way. I still remember when, we were discussing this concept, and the two of them actually came into a room and described how important this idea was. And then the Select Committee was actually authorized by a very strong bipartisan vote in Congress. And from its inception, we've had members on the committee who have really been people who have wanted to learn, to get experts in front of us and decide how the United States could best prepare to win this competition with China. And, it involves economic security, national security, human rights. And of course, Taiwan, our close friendship with Taiwan has been a key part of that. And so our committee has done bipartisan CODELs. I remember going on the CODEL to Taiwan and spending time, and both Mike Gallagher, who was the chairman at the time, and Raja Krishnamurthy, who was the ranking member, were part of that CODEL. And we've continued that, visiting South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, going to Singapore, talking about these issues in a bipartisan way. And our staffs work very closely together on policy recommendations. We try and, when we have committee hearings, we try and work together and get hearings that would be beneficial for the entire body, not just one group or one party, but really. And we view our goal is to help understand, communicate the importance of these issues throughout Congress, but also to the American people, because people in their daily lives have a lot going on, and some of these issues are very complex, and there's a lot of history involved. And China is very aggressive in terms of putting information out there that sometimes is not accurate. And so we feel that we have a great responsibility to the American people, especially at a time such as this.
Before we go on, I have to say, China puts information out there that is sometimes not accurate. It's probably the understatement of the week.
I'm trying not to provoke anything.
Sure. But actually that leads us, the word provoke, to a really, I think, important line of conversation. You may be familiar with General Minahan, who was the Air Mobility Command commander, and he put out that order. He sent that order to his team as a 4-star general, and then unfortunately it was very quickly leaked. And one of the things he mentioned in that memo, in that order, was the need to urgently prepare. And he said, "My gut tells me we may be fighting China as soon as 2025. Obviously, it's 2026 now, but." There were some at the time who thought it was too provocative, right? Even though it was an internal military order that was leaked. So how do we strike that balance between not being seen as provoking China when we talk about setting a little bit more concrete policy and something that's a little less ambiguous to deter China? How do we strike that balance?
Yeah, I think no matter what we do, it's going to provoke China. I mean, you look at what the Prime Minister of Japan said, stating their policy that's very clear, and look at how China has responded to that. So I think, we have to recognize anything we do is going to be provocative, because they're trying to change the narrative on pretty much everything. So I think we just have to be clear, and when it comes to, Xi Jinping has said to be prepared to take Taiwan by force if necessary. He will try and shape things and say, okay, this is an internal matter. I mean, they have their ways of trying to stifle any discussion or rational history. And so I think we have to recognize that we're in that situation. To me, it comes down to having respect for China. It's a long civilization. It's had many dynasties. They have currently, the CCP is a dynasty in China, and we don't know what the future holds for China. But I always say I love the Chinese people. It's just the Chinese Communist Party that's creating all these problems. And you look at the ways that they try and intimidate their neighbors. They try and, the list goes on. So I think we can't be too concerned about provocation. I mean, when was the last time you saw a Hollywood movie with a villain who was Chinese? Like, I can't remember. It's because if you produce a movie like that, it won't sell in China. You can't access the Chinese market. Your actors, your producers, everybody involved will receive sanctions for that particular movie but also your future career. And they are doing that across the board. So we just have to realize that's the world in which we live, and then be clear about American priorities.
That's a great point. And as a child of the Cold War who grew up on those movies about being ready to fight the Soviets, like Red Dawn, a little bit over the top scenario, but I did think it was striking that when they made the sequel to Red Dawn, originally it was going to be the PRC, and then they had to spend millions of dollars to digitally change it to North Korea, right? So not to bash any particular movie. So there was something you said at the beginning that I'd like to pull the thread on a little bit. We were using the word provocation, but it sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Chairman, but it sounds like some of the things are being portrayed by the PRC as a provocation, but actually what you're describing is they're using it as a pretext to change the narrative. They're not actually provoked. They're just seizing the opportunity to make it look like we're the problem. Is that right?
Exactly, and they're doing that with all sorts of gray zone activities in the South China Sea and toward their neighbors. They're doing that in every way. I'll give you one example from my home district. There was a Chinese battery plant, Goshen, that wanted to locate in the district, and has an affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party, and really deceived the local community initially. And then the local community came out and said they basically did not want to have this battery plant in the district. And people who said that they didn't want this CCP-affiliated battery plant were branded as anti-Asian, racist. I mean, just smeared simply because of this opposition to the CCP. And I think, you can see that happening all over the country, and they're very aggressive in those kinds of things. So we just have to realize, and that's why I tend to highlight, I'll meet with people who talk about, why don't you just say positive things about China and don't say, and when you communicate on this, it sounds like you're anti-Chinese. And then I remind them, well, I just met with Claire Lai, who's the daughter of Jimmy Lai. He's in prison, just sentenced with basically a death sentence for speaking out for freedom, democracy, religious liberty. And, there's a difference between, targeting an area versus targeting deception, coercion, and, a authoritarian regime that's suppressing its own people as well as trying to export that around the world.
No, that's a great point. And I really appreciate the fact that committee's name is on strategic competition with the CCP. And I know it often gets sorted into China, and even it's in the cryon there that shows up. But the idea is it's about the CCP. It's not about the Chinese people. I think that's a really important point, and I appreciate that. So now let's shift, though, to another important group of people, and that, of course, is the people of Taiwan. And your counterparts in the legislature in Taiwan are having some pretty tough battles right now. And so, obviously, we don't want to get involved in their domestic politics. But what can we do, as Americans? What can the Congress do? What can the executive branch do, or what can the private sector do to make it simpler for Taiwan to be able to purchase the defense articles it needs to build up its defenses? Because obviously there's challenges in their own system now of going forward, at least, or what it seems, of actually being able to get the budget to acquire these systems. And part of the narrative is a lot of this stuff takes so long to show up. And these are things, of course, that are covered in the report. So any thoughts for the group, especially for those who haven't read the report, that where should we be focusing to help Taiwan build up its defenses?
Well, we need to make sure we get them the munitions that they have purchased, that have been promised, and do it in a timely way. And make sure they're the right kinds of munitions that actually help Taiwan defend itself. And I think that if there was one goal that I would have, and this involves our defense industrial base, this is a challenge across the board, but I think we really have to give special consideration to Taiwan. We saw the people of Ukraine, how they have fought at a situation where people didn't expect them to last more than a few weeks. And I want to see from Taiwan that same sense of commitment. And I still remember some senators going over to Ukraine shortly before Putin invited, and the Ukrainians really didn't believe that Russia was going to invade. And I think if you look at Taiwan, there's probably a huge number of people that really don't know whether that would happen, or maybe are skeptical that that would happen. But I think, you look at our first president, George Washington, he said the best thing you can do to, have peace is to prepare for war. And so I hope that the people of Taiwan are thinking in those terms, and the military spending should reflect that. And I think it's come a long ways. I mean, I would just say in the last few years since I've been there, you can see a focus on getting the right kinds of munitions and kind of an all-of-society approach that's growing there. I think that's very important. The political dynamics, I think there needs to be an all-hands-on-deck that says we want to, and I think there is a general commitment of wanting to increase military spending, but I think that common value needs to continue to grow. I would say, if there was one thing, there's a new movie out, Zero Day Attack. I guess it's a series.
It's a show, yeah.
It's a show.
Mini-series, essentially, yeah.
I hope someone will fund that. I hope someone will allow that to access, the airwaves so people can be exposed. Because what it does is it kind of explores this concept of, A, the threat that the people of Taiwan are under right now, but B, what would that look like if suddenly there's a change across the Taiwan Straits? And I think that kind of awareness is really important for Taiwan, but also around the world. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about Taiwan, the linchpin of the first island chain,
right,
and the threat that also means for Japan, for the Philippines, for Europe, for the global economy. And I think everybody ought to be thinking about how dangerous and how foolish it would be if China were to do that. But we also have to recognize that that's seemingly part of the game plan.
Right. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that particular show, because we had a online seminar we conducted last year talking about understanding sort of the popular view of a potential attack on Taiwan, and raising awareness of that. And the show was one of the things that we discussed. We even showed a little clip from the trailer. So that's a great example. I guess it's a counterexample to the fact that we don't have anything like that show in the United States, right? So it's not an advertisement for Zero Day Attack, but to be clear, I mean, I think it plays an important strategic role, as you said, to broaden the understanding of the American people, of the people of Taiwan, and of allies and friends around the world. The nature of this, make it more tangible, right? Because it seems so theoretical. By way of segue, one of the places where I think this has been a challenge at times in a similar way is I served in South Korea for 12 years. And so our motto was fight tonight. And I see General Scotty Barrier, who was the J2 at the time when I was the chief strategist, who we worked very closely together, my older brother in that command at the time. And we found that there were a lot of South Koreans who just didn't believe the idea that North Korea would attack. But the military very much had the idea that, they had to be ready to fight. And of course, our combined alliance structure there had to be ready to fight. But the focus was always fight tonight against North Korea, right? Not really thinking or even talking about the idea that U.S. forces in Korea might also have to deter or defeat China, and not really talking about, because it's a very sensitive issue, about the potential of what role U.S. bases could play, and even what the ROK-U.S. alliance could do in a scenario, say, where the PRC intervenes on behalf of North Korea, or a scenario where the PRC attacks Taiwan. And so General Brunson, I think, has been leading the way in getting a broad broader conversation about the strategic position of the Korean Peninsula and USFK's role beyond just focusing laser-like on the North Korean threat. And then also you see Undersecretary Colby going there, talking to Korea about broader elements in South Korea needing to take more responsibility in a larger context and these sorts of things. So all that by way of background, and again, I know it's a very controversial issue, particularly in South Korea, but what do you think about the potential role that USFK, US bases in Korea, or the alliance itself could play in deterring, not necessarily fighting, but in deterring that sort of aggression by China?
I think at a minimum, coordination, logistics, as you point out, strategic location is really key. And, when you look at the map and you see the proximity to these different areas, you realize that, Korea is in a key location. And I know the first commitment is to the stability there and to prevent North Korea or any other adversary from taking advantage of any situation. But clearly, our military would need to play a role. And, it would just be a matter of how best to define that makes the most of that strategic location, but also preserves the stability on the peninsula. And I think the relationships with Japan and Korea, the Philippines, have grown so much these past several years. And to me, it's a very exciting time to keep building those friendships. I mean, I play on this tradition, this baseball game in Congress, the congressional baseball game, Democrats against Republicans, goes back 100 years for charity. We're talking about putting together a team that would play the Japanese parliamentarians and maybe the Korean parliamentarians. So baseball diplomacy, because the relationships.
I've been to a few Korean baseball games in Seoul, let me tell you. So
and as a kid, I tell you, I remember it was always Little League, and the All-Stars played the Taiwanese baseball Little League. So there's something about baseball diplomacy that's very important.
Our leadership here at the Atlantic Council is a big believer in sports diplomacy, so we would love to help with that in any way we can. That sounds great. I think that's a really important question and issue, and I just recommend maybe this is something the committee could take up in discussion about looking at the role of the ROK-US Alliance, USFK, just to kind of explore this issue. We have a whole set of questions already in the online portal, askac.org, and we like to do a mix of in-person and online questions. And so while I'm vetting these and seeing what we got, and again, it's got to be on the topic of today. We're not going to talk about domestic, gotcha politics kind of stuff. I'm going to look through these, but I see we've got General Scotty Barrier here in the front row, who I alluded to earlier, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I'm sure he has a question about the threat now. He's in the private sector now, but he's also, full disclosure, we're very proud to have him as a non-resident senior fellow with our program.
I should be asking him questions and having him talk.
Well, to be fair, you can have a little back and forth. This doesn't have to be completely one way. So please, if we could give the general the microphone, and then I'll take a look at what we have. Remember, askac.org. We can still take questions. Thank you,
Congressman. Good to see you. Thanks for your service. Thanks for being here with us today, and thanks so much for that message. I think it really resonates to me personally as former director of DI, where we focused a lot on China and Taiwan, but also this audience. I think it resonated very, very well. I'm no longer in that role. I'm currently with a commercial company, and we believe in this idea that it's not an if, it's a when. And we believe that we can deliver capability, advanced technology to Taiwan through direct commercial sales. So far, we've focused primarily on FMS, and as you know, that system is slow and somewhat cumbersome. Your view, Congress's view on U.S. companies doing direct commercial sales, sort of at FMS prices, for support to Taiwan?
I think we need all hands on deck. And I think we're at a place in history where we need to work together with trusted friends and allies and make sure these alliances are secure. So I certainly think there would be a lot of support for that. There's been so much, our defense industrial base needs to be strengthened. It has to do with, for a while there, manufacturing was leaving the United States. And I think there's a recognition we need more manufacturing here, and we need to have that as part of our defense industrial base. In this window here, I think we need all hands on deck to, again, deter aggression and, promote peace.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that. There's a great ecosystem here between TechRo, AIT, Indo-PACOM, and it's kind of a buy with and through to make it happen. But thank you. I appreciate your comments.
And, I know there's also a lot of interest in, manufacturing in Taiwan and, those enhancing those capabilities. And to me, that makes a lot of sense.
All right, so now we'll go to the virtual audience, and then perhaps we'll go back to the in-person audience after this. So this question follows up on one of the earlier items of discussion. And so this comes from Tom McDevitt from the Washington Times. And he says, Chairman Moolenaar, thanks for your leadership, or excellent leadership. What recommendations do you have for a public-private collaboration to critique and counter CCP information operations and cognitive warfare? So this public-private aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a very important question. Thank you for that, Tom. And you look at the Cold War and you look at the tools that were used to get the ideological messaging out there, sort of behind the Iron Curtain and around the world, and it was pretty clear, and those technologies were used. I think one of the things we've seen in government is we want to try and take a fresh look at some of these ways of communicating, and I think that that's a key goal for the coming year, because a lot of Americans say, well, why are we doing this? I think if there was ever a time in our history where we can celebrate 250 years of the Declaration of Independence, but also look deeper at the principles that were involved for human dignity, for, God-given rights that, the government's job is to secure those rights, and the contrast with these regimes where the people don't have rights, and it's simply the government dictates whatever. And so I think we have a year of, a lot of people are just going to say, what a great country, and, 250 years, happy birthday. But if we have everybody looking at the Declaration of Independence, what is special from the foundation of this country, and for other countries who are living this out in a similar vein, I think we have a great opportunity to make the case that says, there's a big difference between freedom and authoritarianism, similar to what Reagan did in the Cold War, but within new technologies, as well as focusing on these sort of original foundational principles of the United States.
I think that's great. So I see we've got some hands up here, so I'm sorry. Please introduce yourself, and remember, we got to keep this focused on the Taiwan deterrence issue.
Hi, Daniel Alvarez. Thank you very much for your words today. My question is very brief. There's a lot of people talking about the Trump-Xi summit coming up, and I'm wondering specifically in regards to Taiwan, what would be the ideal outcomes from that summit? If you could speak to that, please.
Well, I'd say the ideal outcome is that Xi would want to have good relations with Taiwan as a neighbor, and view things through an eye of mutual prosperity. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I think my guess is that Xi will probably say that's not something we're going to discuss because it's an internal matter for China. And so, I sense that's kind of how Xi will approach that. But I think this is where President Reagan was so good about making the ideological case, even with the Soviet leaders, and having these discussions, and even kind of people throughout the land even being aware of those discussions. Difficult in this situation, but my hope is that, President Trump can talk about, we've asked him to talk about some of the human rights issues, Claire Lai. You look at all the pastors who have been recently rounded up in China and are being detained. A number of their children are here, U.S. citizens. And, I think there's an appeal there, but there's also a moral case to be made. And my hope is that that would come up. I think with respect to Taiwan, I think President Trump stating about, we're going to become more independent in our supply chains from China, and we're going to work with like-minded partners like Taiwan and find ways for our economies to grow and prosper together. And if China wants to be some kind of a reliable, economic partner in these areas, there have to be some changes. So I hope that's the case. But, these things, very difficult to predict how it's going to. I have pretty low expectations in terms of what's going to come out of that. But I think the work that's being done in this country to diversify our supply chains, work with like-minded partners, whether it's critical minerals. I mean, when you look at the critical minerals situation, when China basically fired a loaded gun at our economy and the world economy and basically said, we'll cut off these rare earths, could have shut down our automotive industry, our military capabilities. And when you realize they're willing to use that leverage at any time, there's this 1 year reprieve, if you will. We require this all hands on deck so we aren't in that situation of vulnerability. And I think the administration is really doing a good job responding to that. But I'm not sure that is going to be really discussed with Xi Jinping.
Thank you. So been going through a lot of questions here that several of them tie into the same theme. So I'm going to pick one and then I'll provide a little bit of context to different aspects. So there's a question here, and we'll get it live on the screen, from Chris Calderon, if I'm pronouncing that right. Is U.S. policy that aims to preserve the status quo in the Taiwan Strait appropriate when the PRC has said that it wants to end the status quo and force Taiwan to be united with the mainland? Should the U.S. Instead be trying to, up there on the screen, be trying to recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China to better ensure its security? And so there's some variations on this theme, just the context about, do we need to reduce strategic ambiguity, which is, I know that's something that you've been thinking about. Do we need to adjust the one China policy? Do we need to have a two Chinas policy? Do we need to set clearer red lines? And then do we need to review and update the Taiwan Relations Act? And that's only a sampling of the different things that are related to this. And so I figure you could, if it makes sense to you, Mr. Chairman, kind of address holistically the set of interconnected questions.
Yeah. I think those are all good questions. When you hear of strategic ambiguity, at first you say, okay, is that helpful? I could see it both ways. I'm strategically ambiguous on this. I think there is a case to be made where you recognize that drawing a red line, you have to make sure whatever that red line is, you are willing to enforce that. It's like, if you're a parent, if you tell your children, don't do this, and then you threaten, and then you don't follow up, and then you repeat the threat. That was something I had to learn. I have 6 children, so I had to learn that early in my parenting.
Can't bluff, yeah.
So when it comes to red lines, I think you have to be very clear. And I think the clarity is peace, status quo in the across the Taiwan Strait. I think that's clear. And now, do you need to go beyond that, or does that create, we've got this red line, then they put down this red line, and then pretty soon you're escalating red lines. I think what's more important to me is countering the false narratives every chance we get. when they say, okay, we have the right to this area, and they're drawing new lines and, expanding their areas, I think we need to push back. And they're trying to do that in every international organization, every place. And I think it's just important that we're aware of that, and then we counter the false narrative, that idea to speak the truth in love, so that we don't allow the deception to become the reality.
Right.
I think that's more important than putting a red line, because we've seen where a president will put out a red line and then they don't follow through on that, and then that hurts credibility. I think status quo in the Taiwan Strait is a pretty strong red line, and I think we just need to work with our friends and allies to continue to keep that as the goal and the commitment, and then make sure we back up whatever is necessary.
Understood, Mr. Chairman. So one quick thought. My experience with red lines is looking at it vis-a-vis North Korea a lot, is that your adversary has a tendency to go right up to that red line and take all that space once you set a red line.
Right.
And that is also another problem. But there's something that I wanted to tease out from the beginning of the question. And again, Mr. Chairman, I never want to put words in your mouth, but the whole idea that China is actually trying to change the status quo seems to be fundamental to understanding. So enforcing and defending the status quo is itself requires action on our part.
Exactly. Right? Well, I mean, if you think of it from their understanding is that Taiwan is a breakaway province of China. I mean, and if they view it that way, then the status quo would be, that basically they fulfill the vision. And so I think we need to always be pushing back on that.
Right.
And so that, there's just a misalignment in terms of worldview, if you will, on that. And I think we're very clear on that. There were some people who were concerned about the national defense strategy that didn't specifically mention Taiwan. But I think when you look at the fact that it said, no entity is going to be allowed to dominate the first island chain. I forget the exact wording, but to me, that's very clear where that's intended and what our priorities are.
Right. Taiwan is part of the first island chain.
Exactly. Well, it's a key, it's an anchor for the first island chain.
Absolutely. All right. So I think we have time enough for just one more in-person question. And my goodness, so many hands are up here. I see the gentleman there in the back has been patient. Well, please go ahead. Yeah. And please identify yourself.
Yes, good morning, Congressman. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us. My name is Drew Holliday, former Defense Intelligence Agency. There's no question that the military component is critical for calculations on managing the straits for all actors. But there's also an argument to be made that from Beijing's perspective, the most powerful deterrent may not be the cost of military actions, but the cost from the military action, but the economic and political costs that might come from armed force against Taiwan. I noticed in the report there are some references to economic actions to be taken. They seem to be mostly about shoring up economic resilience for the United States and its allies. So my question is, has the committee considered possibilities for imposing economic cost on Beijing as a consequence for taking armed action against Taiwan? And if so, how have those deliberations run out?
Yeah, it's complicated, as you know, because our economies are so intertwined. That's probably the biggest difference between the Cold War and the situation here. There was legislation that passed almost unanimously. There may have been two people who voted against the Protect Taiwan Act, and it really focused on this idea of if China were to take this kind of an aggressive action, that basically all these international organizations would start to expel China from those entities as sort of a preemptive thing that says basically, here are the consequences up front if they were to do that, which would affect economic areas for them. You know, the G30 nations. So I think Congress is very interested in doing that. You know, I have legislation that I've sponsored on, you know, revoking China's PNTR. I think, to me, you know, it's not a normal trade relationship when they're stealing technology, they're undercutting through unfair trade practices and overcapacity and driving people out of business, you know. So there are different things along the way, but I think you're right. And to your point about the political risks, you know, it's difficult to gauge what's happening with the generals being purged, Xi Jinping's longtime friends being purged for corruption, different. It does appear that Xi Jinping is trying to consolidate power, clearly. And does that make it more dangerous, less dangerous in these situations? It's difficult to gauge, but clearly his interest is, you know, the survival of his regime. And so I think anytime the economy starts to be in trouble or other political problems for him, I think it further attacks his credibility and his sense of, you know, legitimacy. And so I think all these areas play into that.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's an excellent note to end on how broad this issue set is and how broad deterrence of Taiwan is, being more than a military, or deterrence of aggression against Taiwan, more than a military issue. So that's all the time we have today, and I know you do have to get going after this. And I really want to thank you very much. I want to thank our audience in person and virtually for joining. So as we say, today is the end of today's event, but it's not the end of a larger strategic discussion. So thank you all for joining Atlantic Council Front Page and with Chairman Moolenaar of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party.
It.
All right.
Doesn't
Thank you
fit
very
on
much,
a business card, but you got it.
Thank you.